Hello, everybody. My name's Simon Cox. I'm a journalist with The Economist magazine, and I'll be moderating this webinar on defying conventional wisdom, promoting fact-based innovation. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion, and I hope you are too. Before we dive into it, I should thank our sponsors for this event, Philip Morris, and we also want to thank the American Chamber of Commerce in the Philippines for their assistance. I'll be joined by three excellent panelists. You can find their biographies on the website. We have Stacey Kennedy from Philip Morris, we have Henry Aguda from Union Bank, and we have Minette Navarrete from Kickstart Ventures. And the topic we'll be discussing is, of course, hugely germane and urgent right now. The whole world economy is waiting for innovators to come up with a vaccine for the pandemic that's been ravaging the economy. But even as we wait, even as we're impatient for that discovery, we have to let research and evidence collection run their course. There are dangers and potential counterproductive downsides to moving too quickly, even though pace is also of the essence. That's the kind of dilemma we'll be discussing today. Now, I hope you all will also take part. There's a Q&A function that will allow you to submit questions, which I'll put to the panelists. We'll also be providing 3 polling questions throughout the course of the webinar in order to collect some of your views. And in addition, I hope all of you will discuss this with your friends after we finish. So with that, please let me jump into the discussion and open up to the panel with my first question. As I mentioned in the introduction, there is this dilemma, isn't there, in innovation between speed and deliberation, between moving fast and breaking things on the one hand, and on the other hand, doing rigorous research that allows potential pitfalls to arise. I'd like to ask each of you to think about, in your industry, how this dilemma plays out. Henry, why don't I start with you?
Good afternoon, Simon. Yeah, well, evidence-based innovation, it's more of a question of what's your evidence, what are you looking for? So a lot of the times when people go into innovation, they think that the proof of the pudding is the financial part of it, which to me, it's a matter of time. If your innovation initiative works, it will translate immediately to financial, well, not immediately, but it might translate into financial gain. But in the onset of your innovation, some of the pieces of evidence you may be looking for may not be expressed in dollar terms. One of which is scalability, user experience. Are you breaking something that's a habit that have been there for quite a while? So I'm a believer of gathering evidence as you experiment. I mean, that's the cornerstone of any experiment, but the question will be, what will you be looking for? So in our industry, we know that innovation is it's not an overnight thing in terms of results, but we know it's going to be multi-years in execution. So we look in areas where the things that we're doing, are they making a difference in terms of people's habits? Like when you launch a new digital channel, do you see a shift of transactions from over the counter to going online through the app or the internet? So those are the pieces of evidence that we look for to, and we really look for them. Otherwise, you wouldn't know whether your innovation is progressing to the right result or not.
Minette, let me turn to you. You obviously work for one of the oldest business houses in the Philippines, but you work on the venture capital side of that business, hoping to finance new ventures. How do you weigh up the dilemma between moving quickly before your competitors beat you to it and making sure your capital is allocated wisely and prudently? Oh, Minette, could you unmute yourself, please? Thanks.
I think when you think about the question, it isn't really a dilemma. I think it isn't an either-or situation. It is an and situation. I think irrespective of whether you are a startup or you're a large established company, oldest company in the country, it's important to see all the known data, understand the assumptions, and understand the underlying drivers beyond that, but also to kind of understand, what are the unknowns, what are the unknowables, and you get to a point where you realize that going and bringing something to the market is a form of research as well. And for as long as somebody, whether it's a startup or a large company, can test against a real customer, which is frankly the acid test of any sort of innovation, then you have a methodical and hopefully quick method of process of bringing innovation into the market for people to benefit from.
That's a very good point. I suppose the only danger is that acid tests can sometimes be very painful and corrosive. Stacey, how would you answer this question? How would you weigh up the dilemma between speed and research and evidence gathering?
Well, I think it is certainly an important topic globally, and both are important. And I think there's a clear sequence. Obviously, the evidence-based science, from my point of view, has to come first. And then once you have it and there's a clear validation, then the process should move really at speed. So I think we're at a bit of an advantage in my company because we've invested over $7 billion for the past decade to find the solution to combustion of smoking. And so now that we have that solution, and there's over 350 peer-reviewed articles of our science, that we're now at the point that the pace really needs to accelerate. And that's what we're doing globally, with over 50 countries having the product already. And so now is the moment that we need to build the level of societal support from others, including governments who regulate. And I think at that moment, when you have evidence-based research, that you can really then move to be able to make the change in products as quickly as possible.
You mentioned pace and the need to pick up the pace. Of course, events can sometimes dictate the pace at which you can move. We're all of us living with this pandemic, as I mentioned in the introduction. I'm wondering how that has affected your business strategies and the pace at which you can move. Stacey, why don't you tackle that question first?
Sure. I mean, the pandemic has affected everybody globally, and certainly no less than in the Philippines. And I think that it really starts with looking at the consumer that dictates pace. So consumers in Philippines, as well as all over South and Southeast Asia, have been really affected. But in the silver lining around the impact of the pandemic is, I think, a tidal wave of changing consumers' attitudes and beliefs about what's important for them. So a number of studies that we've done, including the Philippines, show that this particular point in time, there's an incredible focus on health, on wellness, and doing what's right for individual and family. And that brings us to believe that now is exactly the right moment to be able to make a big change, to be able to bring products that reduce risk for individuals to the market, and to be able to go with the societal or go with the consumer demand that's really coming now. And that's really been already transpiring, but it's a major part of, I think, the outcome of the pandemic overall.
Right. Henry, let me put that same question to you. I mean, obviously the pandemic has forced people to move towards more digital banking. Were you ready for that transition? Were you ready for that influx of demand?
Yeah, so what Stacey mentioned, the tidal wave of customer changing in behavior to digital, we were ready for that. But we didn't, we prepared many years before the pandemic. And it has actually positively impacted our business in the sense that the number of customers that actually onboarded on our digital rail can be compared to how much customers we would have been able to onboard in 5 years. So imagine compressing 5 years of customer onboarding in just a matter of 6 months. So yeah, we're catching the wave at the perfect time. Unfortunate as it is in terms of the situation, and that is because we prepared for it. And I think in the banking industry in the Philippines, any one of the banks who've prepared for it before the pandemic is now reaping the benefit. Now, the ones that are struggling are the ones who didn't anticipate this. Innovation doesn't happen overnight. Customer behavior actually doesn't happen overnight. It just so happens that right now with this tidal wave, overnight, they've moved to a new way of doing banking transactions. So yeah, we've been prepared for it.
Minette, obviously your portfolio spans a number of sectors. How have they been affected by the pandemic?
Well, like everyone else, there are some really big winners and there are some people who suffer a lot more. I think similar to Henry's experience, one of the things we are saying these days is the pandemic has meant that you kind of get 5 years of customer adoption in 6 months of pandemic. So we have investments where they achieved in 6 months what they had intended to achieve in a year in terms of getting an audience together. So the digital entertainment companies, for example, are doing quite well out of this. People are staying home, and therefore, whether they are interested in watching live streaming on an app like Kumu or reading chapters that are being published by independent writers on an app like Wattpad out of Canada, we are seeing that the adoption rates and the loyalty and engagement is quite high. So one of the things you realize is that in times of a crisis, it's an opportunity to innovate because it's an opportunity. People are open. They're looking for a way to solve certain pain points and change the way they do things. So the openness has served quite a number of startups well.
And what about the other side of the coin? Which sectors are suffering in particular?
Well, we're seeing, overnight drops for companies that are in travel, that are in hospitality. Those are going to take a while because when you look at the research, whether it's research from China or the US or Southeast Asia, the belief of people in how they might begin to travel for leisure again has been shaken. And so that's quite different. We don't think it's a structural change. We think people will continue after a while, but it will be a long while. And so the companies that have prepared themselves, strengthened their balance sheets, maybe have a route to getting out of it. But there are some structural changes as well. So everybody is working from home if they can, if they have that option. And so we think that change is likely to stick for much longer.
Henry, can I ask you about this distinction between structural, lasting change and things that might go back to normal if and when the pandemic subsides? To what extent do you think banking will go back to normal after the pandemic abates?
Wow, that's a perfect question for what we're encountering right now, where people are talking about new normal and are we going to go back to how it was before? I think from a digital adoption, once the customers have experienced digital banking and the convenience of being able to do it, they won't go back to the old way of going to branches, doing over-the-counter transaction. Just to give you some industry numbers, and because things are in flux, the numbers seem to fluctuate. But there's a trend right now. ATM transactions are now going down drastically as a substitute to ATM transaction. That's your InstaPay, and InstaPay is almost doubling every 6 months in terms of volume. Physical checks. This is the first time in so many years that physical check transactions have gone down. And we see them continuing to go down because there's now a solid trend for physical checks to go away. And what's being substituted are mobile check deposits and PesoNet. And the growth is anywhere from 700% to 300% on a bad month, 1,000% on a good month. So you see that the trend is really moving towards digital. And it's a tidal wave, so nobody goes back after the tidal wave. Once they've been washed ashore, they won't be able to swim back. So there are structural changes that have happened already that cannot be returned to how it was before. But there are also questions about work from home, for example. It's still a debate. Will people continue to work from home, or will the offices be relevant? I think those things are still, up in the air. Definitely, there will be some push towards flexible work arrangements, but those are things where my prediction is people will just be too excited to go back to the offices. So that's one of those things that I think will not go away. We'll still see each other in the offices, and hopefully we'll see each other in an event or a venue where we can socialize and interact.
Well, I must say I'm speaking from an office right now, and I hadn't been missing it, but now I'm back, I realize I do miss parts of it. So maybe we'll discover some of the things that we've let go of are actually quite appealing once we have the chance to enjoy them again. Stacey, we've heard from the two other speakers about this tumult of change in the Philippines. You obviously have responsibility for a number of markets across Southeast Asia and South Asia. How does the sort of pace of change in the Philippines, the innovation culture, the adoption culture compare with other markets that you have responsibility for?
Well, Simon, I love working in South and Southeast Asia in general because I think it's one of the most entrepreneurial mindset places in the world. People just generally are innovation-minded, open-minded, and eager to find better ways to do things. And I think Philippines is really at par leading on the pack in many of these areas. I think a couple of the areas that are particularly a focus in my industry in the Philippines are signs that the government is looking to be able to look at innovation across a number of sectors and to be able to set and create the right standards and right regulation that helps to speed innovation. I think it's really important in this particular part of the world, in Philippines particularly, that private sector and public sector work together because it has to be hand in hand. And with that partnership, then the acceleration can really happen.
You mentioned standards. It'd be good if we could to give some specific examples. Are there any particular standard debates that are going on right now that you see as particularly crucial?
Absolutely, Simon. I think that standards, particularly when it comes to consumer products, generally are very important because that's one of the topics that I know we're to discuss here, which is around the speed of innovation. And if innovation is too fast, what are the risks for consumers? And one of the ways I think to look at that is with science, with evidence-based data to be able to support innovation, that it's the right thing for consumers. Then governments put in place a set of standards. And so standards should be based on science. And those product standards then provide protection for individual consumers, protection for society, and help guide the pace of the innovation.
Henry, would you like to comment on the role of standards in the banking industry? It's obviously crucially important to customer security and so on.
Well, yeah, so standards right now is something that we need because as things move very fast and standards are not set for cybersecurity, specifically in data privacy, people get not just inconvenience, but sometimes they get hurt. So we need stronger standards to make sure that people that are offering digital services that are new and innovative and novel ensure that the public is protected. Aside from that, this is also a time for, not a lot of people talk about this, but this is also a time where convergence is becoming more and more prevalent. So convergence among industries, you see ride-hailing services doing delivery, you see telcos now doing financial services companies partnering more with telcos. And because of that convergence factor, there should be a standard that allows everybody to fit together cleanly, seamlessly, and in a secure manner. So it's very important. And in banking, I'm glad that our regulators are actually pushing the necessary standards. Now, standards and having it are different from enforcement. I think standards I'm not so concerned with in terms of what is required by a regulator. I guess what we need to improve on, and I think what we are working towards to is having a fairer and more level type of enforcement. Make it more consistent. And between having standard and enforcement come together, that makes the new normal a more convenient but safer place.
Minette, I saw you smiling ruefully there. Do you want to come in on this topic?
No, I was going to say I completely agree. I think there's a stereotype of startups where, you know, if you think back to the scene, the last scene in The Social Network, where he's in his dorm room, he's in his hoodie, he's got a bottle of beer, and he's coding, and he's putting in names and pictures and, you know, dorm addresses, I think, for people in the initial stages of the Facebook. And actually, you understand how much of a risk that is for people's identities, for people's, in the case of banking, for their financial well-being. And so the standards are absolutely important, and the enforcement as well. And, you know, from an investment point of view, what you would hate is to see something rocket with lots of customers coming on board, and then at some point self-combust when it's hacked, when the data is compromised. So there is a truth to the adage, you know, data is the new oil. There is so much value in data, whether it is enterprise data or customer data. But at the same time, it's highly combustible, and therefore it's important that there are adequate protections for whether it's companies or individuals.
Yeah.
Well, as a journalist, I appreciate that extension of the metaphor.
Yeah. Simon,
Sorry,
if I may add to what Minette mentioned. So we work closely with fintechs and startups, and it's a symbiotic relationship with us. It's not one or the other. And the fintechs love working with us, the bank, because they learn about standards, they learn about regulation. While on the other hand, we learn about innovation and moving fast and being able to deconstruct matters. It's nice that the fintech and the startup community also understand that they cannot also just deconstruct and destroy business processes. They also need to learn how it becomes sustainable. And part of it becoming sustainable is, you know, you implement in your system the standards that allow for the welfare of your customers to be protected and enhanced. So it's a good symbiotic, and what brings us together is, you know, learning the standards and us providing the fintech community what we know of in terms of standards.
Stacey, is there any danger that standards can be too strict and therefore counterproductive?
I mean, yes, Simon, I think absolutely so, because the object of innovation is to be able to allow consumers to enjoy it. And they can't take advantage of innovation if they don't have access to it, or they don't understand what it is and what it means for them. So I think that's a critical component, that consumers have the right to information. I mean, the reality is that not all products are alike. And that's absolutely true in my industry. Not all smoke-free products, reduced risk products that are intended as a better alternative to cigarettes are the same. But if consumers don't know about them at all, then they don't have access to them, and they can't differentiate. So to me, the standards that government should really set is a minimum to make sure that the products that are available to consumers are the ones that meet, that are science-based and meet safety criteria. And then the government sets standards that allows that communication to consumers so they understand exactly what it is and why it's a better alternative to continuing smoking.
I suppose what's also crucial here is the counterfactual, right? You know, if the product isn't introduced, what will people be doing? I guess that's a particularly germane right now when we're considering, you know, a potentially dangerous vaccine, but in its absence, people are facing a very evidently dangerous disease. So what role does that consideration play?
Yeah, I think this is really about benefit and risk. So I think when regulators are looking at decisions, particularly for a replacement product, this is a cannibalizing product. Smoking has been around for centuries, and there hasn't been a lot of innovation in the conventional cigarette. It's lit on fire, it burns, and it produces harmful toxicants that cause tobacco-related diseases and death. That's a fact. And so then when you have to look at what is the alternative to that, and the reality is that reduced risk products, and particularly our portfolio of products, have been scientifically tested and reduced 90 to 95% of the harmful toxicants versus what's produced by a cigarette. And that's the type of standard that I'm talking about that's really critical to make sure that all products meet that level of scientific standard, but also provide the information about benefit, that there's less risk versus continuing to smoke a standard cigarette, but also communicate that they're not risk-free. That's really important, that consumers have that access to information that's created by the regulation in many countries already today.
I'd like to get the audience involved at this point, if I could. We've had a couple of questions submitted over the Q&A. I will ask those, so please keep them coming. We also have some questions for you. We have some polling questions. I wonder if we could call the first polling question up right now, because it relates to the discussion we've just been having. The first question, I believe, is in your line of work, how important is relying on facts and evidence rather than on conventional wisdom? And you have 5 choices, so please do pick a choice. I suppose we're all tempted to think that innovation is hugely important, facts and evidence are hugely important to our industry, but I do know some industries that seem to rely entirely on conventional wisdom, particularly the political punditry that we're all hearing so much of right now. So please be honest. In your line of work, how important is conventional wisdom? How important is facts and evidence? And we'll call up the results in a moment. Before we do, perhaps I'd like to ask a question that a member of the audience has put forward. The question relates to Mark Zuckerberg, has already been mentioned once. He has this motto of move fast and break things. Is that contradictory to fact-based innovation? Minette, you mentioned the social network earlier. How much value do you put in this motto of move fast and break things?
I think it depends on what you're breaking. We obviously don't want to break the law. We obviously want to make sure that customers are protected, that the vulnerable are not put at risk. At the same time, as Stacey points out, it's a cost-benefit thing, and there are people who are more willing, more open. So in many cases, social networks being one of them, people are willing to trade off privacy and attention for the enjoyment, I guess, the amusement, the connections. And in that case, as long as people are well aware and making free choices, I think that's a good balance.
And we've had a second question that perhaps follows on from that, which is any company that's thinking about embracing digitization or innovation more broadly, what criteria should they look at before jumping in? So what should guide them so that they don't break the wrong things? Minette, why don't you have a go at that, and then I'll perhaps ask Henry.
I think for us, certainly, because the Ayala Corporation and the companies within the group are all moving towards digital transformation, the adaptability in terms of the employee experience is equally important as the customer experience. So on both sides of the bank counter, on both sides of the network, it's important that the digital transformation makes things better, faster, easier, less expensive. So we balance those things against the reality that transformations create risk, that you may invest in something that maybe becomes obsolete very quickly, or maybe you think you love it, but the customers hate it. So there is a bit of trial and error in there as well, and we accept that.
Henry, can I ask you to comment on the point Minette just made about customer versus employee? We tend to focus very much on customers, sometimes forget about the employees. So how much consideration should be given to the employees when embracing some of these new technologies?
Well, it's as Minette earlier mentioned, it's not an or, it's an and, right? So in our case, it's employee and customer. So everything that we do in the in product development and in the selection of our technology and how we deploy it centers on what the customers would want. That's why we have a strong agile organization where we home in on the customer needs. So we prioritize the customer to that point. Now, on the employee side, the way we harmonize it is if our employees appreciate the culture of an agile organization, then we're enhancing our employees' value and we're enhancing our employees' skill set. And that harmonizes the fact that an agile organization will always home in on the customer's requirements. The products that we've launched are basically asking the customer first. In fact, we have a management committee that vets all the projects, and our CEO is very pedantic with this one. If any project proponent cannot explain what he's trying to build from the lens of a customer, then he doesn't go beyond explaining the second paragraph of second deck. So it's both. And maybe if I can comment also to what was said about move fast and break stuff. And I agree with Minette. It depends on what you break. Let's not break the law. So since we're a regulated company in a very regulated industry, a lot of the innovation we wanted to implement could not have been done if there weren't regulatory changes. So we moved very fast to show to our regulators a sandbox of what could be. And the nice thing about our regulator is we didn't have to break the law. They actually modified some of the laws. And in fact, if you read the past circulars for the past 3 years of our BSP, if you follow it strictly, all the banks in the Philippines would already be moving digital. So move fast and try to influence change. I guess that's more the better mantra.
That's great. We should probably take a look at the results of the poll. If we could call up the results, please, now. So the question, again, was whether relying on conventional wisdom or evidence was very important in your industry. And clearly, most people are saying the facts and evidence are what's important. There were a few honest people who are saying there's an equal balance between the two. And actually, one of the questions we've got from our audience is, how does this question differ from sector to sector? That is, are there some sectors that are governed by conventional wisdom and will remain so? Others where facts will take over completely. That's an interesting question to think about. What industries do you think can get by just relying on conventional wisdom? Are there any examples we can think of? I mentioned perhaps political punditry as one that prospers with conventional wisdom. Many of you will have seen the movie Moneyball, in which baseball for a long while seemed to prosper on the basis of conventional wisdom. I don't know if there are any other industries that come to mind. And perhaps putting it more positively, someone's asked, well, is there a role for intuition? Minette, why don't I put that question to you? Given that you fund companies across a whole variety of sectors, there must be some difference between them in how rigorous they can be and which ones have to rely more on intuition.
I was going to say that frequently intuition is the sum total of a hell of a lot of data. And for ourselves, certainly, one of the least glamorous things about venture capital is the amount of due diligence that you do. So I'm a big believer in breathing the same air, obviously not literally these days, but breathing the same air as the companies that you invest in, understanding what the vision is, digging down into the numbers with them. So particularly the ones where we sit on the board of the company, we get involved in a lot of things, not because we want to run the company for them, but because we want to understand what they're trying to do so that we can be better supportive. So in my case, you sharpen your intuition by understanding maybe the micro details of an industry and getting the hint that the industry is changing, is ripe for change. So one of the hardest things to learn is the timing of when something will break. To use Henry's metaphor, when does the tidal wave come in? And that's when you see things changing. So I kind of imagine that while intuition sounds like it's magical moments, it's actually quite a lot of rigor and discipline that brings the magic together.
Stacey, would you like to add to that? I mean, your industry is such an interesting amalgam of science and fashion, really. There must be quite a large role for intuition.
Yes, I was just thinking as Minette was adding about it's really down to the timing. And I think that it must be true in many industries that are cannibalizing industries, that are disrupting themselves. I know it certainly is for mine. But I think as I've listened and I've been a part of this at my company for the past 10 years, the moment of timing, and you can call it intuition, but I think it's really more about the moral imperative. And the fact is that when you develop a product that you know is vastly superior than to what people are using today, and you ask yourself, okay, but then is it the right business climate? Are regulators ready? Are consumers ready? But the reality is that it's simply the right thing to do from a human perspective to bring an innovation to consumers when you know it's better. And so I think that there's a level of intuition, there's a level of timing, but there's also just a sense of what is the right thing to do. And from a sustainability standpoint, we know that in our industry that the sustainability problem starts with the product. And if you don't have a better product than a cigarette, then this sustainability factor is simply not there. So I think that's some of my thoughts around the timing aspect that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Thank you. Let's ask another poll question, if we could. Can we call up the second poll question, please? I believe this one is, again, about the role innovation can play, not just in companies, but in facing some of the world's biggest challenges. I mentioned at the beginning, obviously, we're all waiting for innovators to help us fight the pandemic. What other big challenges do we face that might be amenable to innovative solutions, and which challenges really just require old-fashioned solutions or perhaps simple political will? So please do tick the box that best reflects your views, and we'll call up the results in a minute. On a somewhat related theme, someone in the audience asked the question whether innovation by small enterprises can be supported through government research subsidies, or whether the government is spending too much on ameliorating poverty. I don't know if you see a trade-off between those things, but please do weigh in. Minette, why don't you have a go at that question? Research subsidies from the government versus, I guess, what you might call more ameliorative welfareism from the government.
Now, I understand this. I've been on a number of technical working groups working with the Senate and the Congress to try and address, create more opportunities for this. And I guess one of the things from a Philippine perspective that's important to understand is that there are a number of government agencies where the mandate is specifically around ameliorating poverty. So, in fact, in one of these sessions, I had asked the House of Representatives if the objective for supporting companies and startups was around inclusion, or if it was around a grand ambition of a more innovative, more successful Philippines. The answer from the House of Representatives was, in fact, that it was intended to mitigate poverty and to create opportunities for people who had less, rather than to create big, ambitious, successful businesses. So that's kind of the baseline data. Do I agree with it? I'm a venture capitalist. I have a different view. I think that the way out is to find and fund big winners. But I understand that we live in a country where there are many who still are at poverty line and below. So I can see why legislators would choose a different tack. Does it answer your question?
Yeah, that's a great answer. Henry, how would you tackle this question? I'm thinking in particular of the problem of the unbanked in the Philippines and whether the government has the right emphasis on innovation versus just straightforward subsidy.
Yeah, so right now, I think it's the call of the time. So since we're currently in this pandemic, I think I'd go for amelioration at this point because I mean, you see the day-to-day news of people struggling to get by. I do appreciate the need for investing in innovation, but it may be a matter of timing. Once we get our heads above water from this crisis, by all means, the government should provide a lot of support in terms of encouraging small startups, providing them not just funding actually, but marketing support in terms of being able to provide the structural environment so that they can bring whatever they innovate to other markets as well. So I guess it's a matter of timing. So for now, like Union Bank's been helping the government with the distribution of the amelioration. I guess we're just right in the middle of that thing right now. So we just have to prioritize that for now. Then hopefully next year, once things have stabilized, we can now focus on the important things that will sustain us moving forward.
Stacey, do come in if you want to. Otherwise, I can call up the results of our second polling question. If we could show those now. So once again, people are quite convinced that innovation is the key to solving many of the world's big challenges. Interesting, though, that there are still a small number of people who think it's not important at all. And I guess, I do sometimes feel a little bit techno-skeptic myself when I think of many of the challenges we face are things that could be solved with really quite old technologies if they were implemented properly. Let's see. So we've discussed a little bit the role of policy, but policy has to come from somewhere. It has to be guided from somewhere. I'm quite interested in how policy gets made and what information policymakers listen to. Perhaps we could collect some thoughts on that topic. Stacey, obviously industries, the private sector often know the most about a particular product or a particular industry, but they also have the most at stake. So policymakers could be forgiven for being a little bit skeptical of what they're told by private industry. How should policymakers resolve that dilemma?
Yeah, Simon, that's a really important topic. And I also wanted to address the previous one that Minette and Henry spoke on, so I'll try to weave them together. I think the way that policymakers should really try to make these decisions is the whole theme is around evidence and science. And so and yes, private companies, typically large companies, are the ones that have the vast majority of the science prepared, all of the analysis. And yes, there are some trust issues that come between that. And so policymakers are asking, can we trust the science that is completed by private companies? So I'm a firm believer that the trust is built as a first step through transparency. Transparency in data, transparency in scientific process and protocol, and in scientific sharing of that with third-party reviews by scientists and scientific bodies. And I think that policymakers should really look to third-party reviews as well as beginning to look at the science themselves in order to make fact-based decisions. Now, I think where that can tie in is the fact that this is one big system. So one accelerator of all of that is that many countries like the Philippines do not have to start from square zero themselves. Other countries have really taken the lead in setting rigorous processes to evaluate a lot of the science and the research that exists on many topics. I can simply give you the topic or the example from the tobacco industry. There are a number of countries, and I'll just mention the United States FDA, that put in place several years ago, a very rigorous process for tobacco products that must meet critical standards and have science supporting that in order to be able to commercialize the product in the United States, in order to receive modified risk tobacco, or to have modified risk tobacco claims. So just last quarter, throughout this entire rigorous review, IQOS, our leading flagship brand in the reduced risk portfolio, was granted the modified risk tobacco claim in the United States. So that's an excellent example for Philippines and other countries in Southeast Asia to look at what was the protocol that was set forth, how rigorous were the standards that were set, and then what is the outcome, and to be able to use that as a starting block rather than starting all the way from square one. So I think that's really a critical way that countries can accelerate by looking at the transparency and processes of other countries.
Yeah, we've had quite a sort of skeptical question from a member of the audience saying that, if innovation involves changing the status quo, then what about the role of vested interests, people who benefit from the status quo? Will they only promote the facts that actually support and bolster the status quo, or worse, will they actually try and discredit facts that might change it? I don't know quite how to sort of pin that question down, but there is this suspicion sometimes that often incumbent companies benefit from the way things are, and therefore will try and shift the information environment accordingly. Is that something you worry about?
And I certainly worry about it because I think that it's very honest and it's very fair, and that perspective is out there. So we might as well call it like it is and say that level of questioning and that level of distrust exists. And the best way to cut through that is to have very honest conversation and dialogue. And then again, to revert back to the science. And it's not about believe me, believe my company, believe my science. I think that should be put much more in the hands of third-party scientists and scientific bodies. So you have a level of independence, you have a level of independent review. And that's what I think is really critical. And that's why I mentioned the US FDA process, where that was really an independent review. And so it becomes less about trust me than trust the science and trust the independent scientific bodies that are reviewing that. The other factor, I think, to address that question, and that leads a bit back to what Henry and Minette were talking about before, is who has what to gain. And I think there's a whole ecosystem around existing industries that are innovating. And the ecosystem is we have to look at how many stakeholders are there in this, and who's in the status quo and who's in the innovation. So I can give the example from my industry, and I think both Minette and Henry gave one, is that there's a whole host of stakeholders. I mean, in the Philippines, there are thousands of tobacco farmers. There's 15 million smokers themselves. There are over 1 million retailers, predominantly sari-saris. And this is their livelihood. And so you have to look at how do all of those stakeholders in the entire ecosystem benefit from a new innovation. And that's what I think that we look at very closely, is how do we bring everyone along together? Because it should be better for smokers, and it should be better, and also including the farmers and retailers and manufacturing sector have a win out of that too, as well as the government. So I just think that's kind of this question that came before of, is it one versus is it the other? I also think this gets at the topic of poverty when you're talking about the livelihoods of retailers, that if you bring everyone forward together, then the system, really works on itself.
Yes, and I do want to discuss more the role of downsides to innovation, the potential losers. Before I do that, just staying on this sort of topic of whose information gets listened to. Minette, could I ask you, obviously you work for an incumbent business house, has a very long, venerable history. You're also financing these new ventures. Are any of them sort of wary about joining with Kickstart, given its backing by an incumbent?
I think there is a wariness. I think there's always a worry that a company that has the resources might copy, might pirate people from a startup. And then that's a real risk that we acknowledge. And I think similar to what Stacey said, trust is earned. Trust is earned over the series of interactions that we do. We work quite hard. I think The thing to understand, perhaps, is that the opportunities are greater if we collaborate. There are things that large incumbents can offer in terms of scale, in terms of business momentum. There are things that startups can offer, the creativity, the irreverence. And so our experience has been that over the years, we've been viewed as more important in terms of not necessarily the money. There's always going to be somebody with more cash to invest, but to have our name on their cap table means something. It means that they have withstood the rigor of due diligence, and it means that we can open certain doors for startups. They'll still have to go in and close the deal, but they have the ability to be listened to, and new opportunities are presented to them because at the moment, after the moment where we've invested, we have a good alignment of our interests in a way that a commercial deal doesn't offer. So I think that, coupled with the fact that digital means there's so much information that's visible, I think that helps, and that means that it's possible to earn trust.
Thank you. Henry, let me ask you about this question of how you can bring people along with you. Stacey mentioned the importance of identifying stakeholders and trying to include them. We've also had a question from the audience about what role there is for inclusive innovation, or whether innovation is just a capitalist's game. Can you think of examples, either in your industry or in the Philippines more generally, where innovation has successfully brought people along with it? Or perhaps contrary examples where it's created a lot of losers?
Well, with this current pandemic right now, the things that we thought were the innovation that we brought in the banking sector, like being able to open an account through your app, being able to deposit checks or withdraw money through different counters, not just your bank branch, has helped in this time and age to administer the amelioration support that the government is providing. Also, it has allowed a lot of small and medium enterprises to still do transactions online. So that's an example where innovation is pulling everybody to one direction. Of course, you can argue it's the tidal wave that made this all happen. But being that as it is, the innovation that were there a year, 2 years ago for digital banking is now being mainstream. So maybe I could segue to the discussion earlier, because it just hit my mind right now. The debate about conventional wisdom and evidence-based innovation. I mean, thinking about it, that's very true for banking. I just did the trip down memory lane just now. 2 years ago, the conventional wisdom for the industry was to build more branches and to build more ATMs, and increase your revenue through fees. When Union Bank decided to go into the digital transformation, it's not because of the conventional wisdom that was prevailing at the time. We looked at the evidence of where banking is going worldwide. Branches are going down, ATMs are getting reduced, people are doing API calls between banks. Open banking is already mature in other developing countries. And in my head, why won't the other banks see the evidence right now and innovate accordingly? I guess that's where conventional wisdom and evidence-based innovation compete. Banking is such a very regulated industry. It has a lot of traditions and practices that have been rooted there. Now, the tidal wave has happened. The conventional wisdom suddenly changed. They're now looking at the fact-based materials that are before them, that have been before them for quite some time. So weird. Now, I think now I understand the interplay between the practitioner's wisdom and looking at hard evidence on what you should be innovating on.
Thank you. We have one more poll question, which relates to the discussion we've just been having. It's about potential downsides of innovation and untested new technologies. How worried are you about the potential downsides of innovation and untested technologies? Again, you have 5 choices, so please do put your response. Henry, staying with you, we discussed earlier before coming online some of the problems that jeepney drivers in the Philippines have faced. One area where perhaps innovation has created a lot of losers. Could you tell our audience a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the problem with the sad state of our jeepney drivers is because of the pandemic, their obsolescence in terms of that iconic jeepney has been accelerated. You know, we're moving into more environmental friendly vehicles, and it would have taken us several years, or we could have changed out the jeepneys. But right now, they've been changed out almost overnight, and that's a sad state where innovation allowed for a sector of society to be left behind. In contrast, again, kudos to our regulator. And I mentioned earlier, as ATM transactions go away, the BancNet organization that runs the ATM transactions are also the ones running InstaPay. So as an innovation phases out an old way of doing stuff, the same organization is kept relevant. I mentioned about checks being obsolete. The same organization that runs the Philippine Clearinghouse Corporation is the same organization that's running PesoNet. So as physical checks fade away, PesoNet, which is the high-value money digital transfer, is also run by that organization. So you could see the contrast on how our regulator in the banking industry manage innovation to make sure that it is inclusive and nobody gets left behind. And there are industries, sad to say, where innovation has basically left them left behind in the wake of the change.
Thank you. We don't have much time left. I would like to put one last question from the audience, which I think is a nice one to close with, which is how can we apply innovation in our day-to-day lives? Now, while you're considering that more personal question, I wonder if the results are ready for the last polling question. Could we call those up? Okay. So there are some people, about half, who are either fairly or very worried about the downside of new technologies. But by and large, this is a fairly sanguine group, I think, who are either have no strong opinion about it or not too worried. Interesting result, I think, perhaps reflects the sort of people who would be attracted to a webinar on innovation. Now, what is the question? How can we apply innovation in our day-to-day lives? We don't have much time left, so please, quick response. Stacey?
Well, the first thing that came to my mind is I simply look at my twin daughter's use of technology and innovation. And that's the fastest way for me to apply something on a personal level. I think as business leaders, as companies, probably one of the most important things for us to do is just simply live by the old adage that if you do what you've always done, you'll get what you've always got. And I think that's not very good for consumers, for societies, or for our businesses. And so I think we have to constantly be looking for where there are better solutions and try and then look at the evidence base to move forward.
Minette?
I think for me, I look for what is the biggest pain point? Where is there the biggest inconvenience, the biggest gap? And find the list of what are the options that are available and test them. I think, as you say, it's a fairly sanguine group. Just run the test, run little experiments in your life to see which things, maybe small changes will make a big difference. Because that's how we have seen startups start small and scale fast. And that should work for your personal life as well.
And Henry, what about you?
To me, to the people who are listening, you're already innovating. I mean, to me, innovation is about experimenting, learning, trying to find new ways of doing old stuff. Like if you're watching this webinar right now, you're innovating, you're trying to learn by doing it in the comforts of your homes, not attending a physical event or what have you. And I see innovation happening all over the place day to day.
Exactly.
Personally, I go by with my daughter also. I'm trying to figure, she's 18 months or so. I mean, the time has really moved very slowly. So 18 months, and I'm trying to figure out how I can stimulate the growth because she's not able to play with other kids. So I'm innovating with toys and with cardboards and whatever you have. So for as long as you're trying to solve something every single day and you're enduring it, you're innovating.
I realize that parenting is one thing that relies hugely on conventional wisdom and rather less on rigorous evidence. But thank you ever so much for your contributions. I'm afraid that's all we have time for. It just remains for me to thank you, the audience, my three excellent panelists, and also Philip Morris for sponsoring the event, and the American Chamber of Commerce in the Philippines for their assistance too. Thanks very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.